She fired him in front of 20 executives and never learned his name. He walked out without a word, without a protest, without even a backward glance, and she thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 20 minutes later, the 42-story tower she had built from nothing began pulling itself apart from the inside. Elevators locked, doors sealed, hundreds of people trapped. And somewhere in the chaos, her 9-year-old daughter was standing alone beneath the one structure about to give way first. The man she had just thrown out was the only person who knew how to stop it, and he went back anyway. If this story already has your attention, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. We release new stories every week, and some of them will stay with you for a long time. Hit the like button if you're watching, and drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're tuning in from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that morning, and to the man nobody in that building thought was worth remembering. The elevator doors opened on the 38th floor at 7:14 in the morning, and Logan Vance stepped out carrying a canvas tool bag, a lukewarm coffee in a dented thermos, and absolutely no intention of being noticed by anyone. That was by design. He was 38 years old, medium height, built the way men get built when physical effort has been part of their daily routine for so long that their bodies stopped making announcements about it. There was nothing dramatic about the way Logan Vance moved through a room. He didn't fill a doorway. He didn't draw eyes. He had the quality that some people spend years trying to manufacture and never quite manage the ability to be present without being seen. He wore a gray maintenance uniform with Sterling Crest facilities stitched across the chest in plain block letters, and he had worn some version of that uniform for 3 years. He knew every mechanical room in the building, every access shaft, every junction box, and pressure gauge and thermal sensor on all 42 floors. He knew which HVAC units ran hot, which drainage lines had a history of backing up in cold weather, and which floor's electrical panel the previous maintenance crew had quietly been working around for 2 years without ever documenting the fault. Logan had documented it on his second week. Then he fixed it on his third. Nobody had said anything about it. Nobody ever said much about anything Logan did, which suited him perfectly. He came in early, worked methodically, took lunch alone in the service corridor off the lobby, and left at 4:30 so he could pick up his daughter from the after-school program 2 blocks from their apartment. The routine had a shape to it that he trusted. He had spent years learning to trust things with shape and structure, and he had also spent years learning what happened when shape and structure failed suddenly and without warning. He thought about that less than he used to, most days. The 38th floor was quiet this early. The executive suites didn't fill up until 8:30 or 9, and the cleaning crews had already come and gone. Logan walked the corridor with a practiced eye, running a slow scan along the ceiling panels, the floor seams, the air returns mounted near the crown molding. He was supposed to be checking a reported vibration near the northeast HVAC unit. Somebody on the 37th floor had submitted a maintenance ticket 2 days ago, intermittent low-frequency noises, irregular, not consistent with normal system cycling, and Logan had already been through the unit twice without finding the source. He found the northeast unit, crouched beside its access panel, and listened. The building was never completely silent at this hour. There was always something, the hum of circulation systems, the faint mechanical respiration of a structure, this size just existing, just holding itself up against gravity and wind. Logan had learned to hear inside that ambient noise the way some people could hear a conversation across a crowded room. He filtered, separated, categorized. He heard the vibration within about 90 seconds. Subtle. Not the unit itself. Something behind the unit, deeper in the wall, a low resonance that came and went in irregular pulses, like something intermittently under pressure that wasn't meant to be. Logan pressed one hand flat against the wall panel and felt it. Not HVAC, not electrical. Structural. He stayed crouched there for a moment, very still. Then he stood, picked up his tool bag, and started walking toward the east side of the floor, following the corridor as it curved around the building's inner core. He was moving toward the restricted section, the executive corridor that ran along the east face of the building, where the boardroom sat behind glass walls overlooking the city, but he wasn't thinking about the restriction. He was following the vibration, which was getting marginally stronger as he moved, and he needed to understand its origin before he could determine how serious it was. Turned the corner and walked directly into Audrey Blackwood. She was not a woman who announced herself with volume. Audrey Blackwood was 30 years old, 5'6", dressed in a charcoal suit that had been made for her specifically and fit accordingly, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that processed everything in a room within the first 3 seconds of entering it. She had been running Sterling Crest Holdings since she was 26. When she had taken the company, her father left at the edge of insolvency and rebuilt it into something with 42 floors and its name on the skyline. She had not done that by being patient with problems she didn't understand or tolerant of people in places they didn't belong. Excuse me, her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Logan stopped. "This floor is restricted," Audrey said. She was holding a tablet, a coffee that was probably going cold, and the expression of someone who was already 3 problems deep into a day that was only 40 minutes old. Behind her, through the glass panels of the boardroom, Logan could see a half-dozen people settling into chairs: executives, board members, a couple of faces he recognized from the quarterly emergency drills he'd helped coordinate. "I know," Logan said. "I'm maintenance. There's a vibration in the east wall I've been tracking from the floor below. I need to get closer to the source. Maintenance is scheduled for this floor on Thursdays." "I know, but today is Tuesday." Logan paused. He was aware that this was not going the direction of a productive conversation, but he also had his hand on the wall behind him, and the wall was vibrating. "There's something in the east support structure that's been generating irregular pressure pulses for at least 2 days," he said, keeping his voice even. "It might be nothing. I'd like to confirm that before the building fills up." Audrey looked at him the way she might look at a maintenance ticket that had been filed in the wrong system. "This meeting begins in 8 minutes, she said. "I have board members in that room and institutional investors arriving by 9. I don't have time for an unscheduled inspection based on a feeling." "It's not a feeling. I can feel it through the wall." She stared at him. Not unkindly, exactly more the way someone stares at something that is technically making a coherent argument, but is also clearly not going to stop being an inconvenience. "What's your name?" "Logan Vance." "Logan." She said it like she was filing it. "I need you to leave this corridor. Let us get through the morning and submit a formal maintenance request through facilities. Someone will follow up. The formal request is already in. I submitted it 2 days ago and flagged it as priority." Brief pause. "Then someone will follow up," she repeated in the tone of a sentence that was over. Logan opened his mouth, and then he heard footsteps behind him, 2 of Sterling Crest's security officers, rounding the far end of the corridor, probably alerted by the corridor cameras, moving in that unhurried but deliberate way that meant they had a job to do. He looked at Audrey. She had already turned slightly toward the boardroom, attention redistributing toward more pressing problems. Security officers reached him. "Sir, you need to come with us." What happened next took about 4 minutes, which was long enough to be thoroughly humiliating and short enough that most people would only catch pieces of it. It happened in the corridor outside the boardroom, visible through the glass walls to everyone seated inside. Audrey had followed them back. Logan wasn't sure why, unless she wanted to ensure the situation was handled cleanly, and she stood near the doorway while the security officers positioned themselves on either side of him. A man Logan recognized as Denton Cole, one of Sterling Crest's senior board members, had turned in his chair to watch through the glass with the particular expression of a man who considered observing other people's difficulties a minor entertainment. Audrey spoke clearly and without heat. This employee entered a restricted floor without authorization during an active board preparation period. I want his access badge deactivated, and I want his employment status reviewed by the end of the morning. One of the security officers, a broad-shouldered man named Keyes, who had always been decent enough to Logan in the hallways, kept his face professionally neutral and said, "Yes, miss." "Blackwood." "Wait," Logan said, not angrily, "just wait." Audrey looked at him. "I hear you about the timing," he said. "I understand this is a bad morning. But whatever is generating that vibration is in the east structural support, and if it's what I think it might be, the timing on it isn't going to care about your board meeting." Cole laughed from inside the boardroom. It was the kind of laugh that required an audience and knew it had one. Audrey didn't laugh, but she also didn't change her expression. "Mr. Vance," she said carefully, "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave this floor. If you do that quietly, we'll handle the rest through HR, and there won't be any reason for this to become something worse." Logan looked at her for a moment. She was not a cruel person. He could see that actually, underneath the control and the pressure and the 8 minutes to board call. She was a person under enormous strain who had made a calculation about which problem was manageable and which one wasn't, and she had miscalculated. He understood miscalculation. He had made enough of them to recognize the shape. "Okay," he said, He walked to the elevator with the two security officers. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't turn around. Keys pressed the lobby button, and the three of them rode down in silence, which was the only appropriate response to a situation that didn't have a good outcome for anyone. The maintenance locker room was on the basement level, below the parking structure, in a part of the building that smelled like concrete and machine oil, and the particular institutional quiet of spaces that existed to serve a purpose rather than to be occupied. Logan sat on the bench in front of his locker and looked at his badge, which Keys had taken with a quiet apology before leaving him there. He thought about calling HR. He thought about his union rep. He thought about the conversation he was going to have with Ellie tonight, trying to explain without making it bigger than it was, without scaring her. She was 8 years old and had been through enough disruption for one childhood already. She didn't need her father's job to be another thing that changed without warning. His thermos was on the bench beside him. The coffee was cold by now. He started pulling items out of his locker, his personal tools, the extra work gloves he kept for winter jobs, the battered paperback he read during breaks, and stacking them in his tool bag. He was almost done when he heard the control panel. The mechanical systems monitoring station was mounted on the wall at the far end of the locker room, a legacy installation from when this basement level had housed the building's primary operational center before they'd moved it upstairs, and this panel had been demoted to a secondary status display that nobody looked at anymore. Logan had looked at it, because Logan looked at everything once. He knew its layout. The indicator that was flashing red was the Eastern Support Column thermal sensor. He crossed the room in 5 steps. The readout showed a thermal differential that wasn't supposed to exist, a heat signature accumulating inside the structural steel itself, which indicated mechanical stress at a level that building steel was not designed to sustain quietly. Beside it, the pressure readings from the HVAC containment zone were climbing in a way that meant the system was beginning to redirect load it wasn't built to redirect. Logan stared at the numbers. He had seen structural failure before. Not in buildings, in other kinds of structures, in other kinds of conditions, in other parts of the world, where things were held together with significantly less engineering and considerably more prayer. He knew what the readings looked like in the 20 minutes before something stopped holding. He was looking at those readings. The floor shifted beneath his feet barely, maybe a centimeter of lateral movement, the kind of thing you would dismiss as a truck going by outside. But Logan had his hands on the panel, and he felt it in the steel. He stood there for 1 second. Then he grabbed his tool bag and ran. The service corridors in Sterling Crest Tower were the building's circulatory system narrow passages behind the public walls, accessible only to maintenance staff, running vertically through the core in shafts that bypassed the main elevator banks. Logan knew them the way he knew his own apartment. He had walked every section of them in his 3 years here, mapping them the way he mapped everything methodically, completely, with the understanding that you only needed to know where everything was once, and then you always knew. He hit the ground floor service access and pushed through the door into the lobby just as the first tremor moved through the building. Small, barely perceptible. The kind of thing that made the pendant lights above the reception desk sway gently and made the receptionist look up from her desk with a small frown and then look back down. Logan stopped in the middle of the lobby and looked at the ceiling. The eastern side of the atrium, the grand central space that ran up through the heart of the lower floors, 30 feet of open air capped by a skylight, showed a thin new crack along the crown of the arch that faced east. It hadn't been there yesterday. It hadn't been there this morning. It was there now. Logan calculated. Eastern support column. Thermal stress. Pressure redirect. 42 floors above. And Audrey Blackwood's board meeting. And the investors on their way. And the employees already filtering in through the front doors. He could see them. Dozens of people crossing the lobby with their coffee cups and their laptops and their headphones in, moving through a building that was trying, quietly and without announcement, to begin coming apart. He pulled out his personal phone. He needed to reach building management. He needed to reach the city's structural emergency line. He needed to reach Miles Danner, the security chief, who was at least a person with authority who took building concerns seriously. He started dialing. Above him, 40 floors up, the executive boardroom hummed with the careful performance of competence and confidence. Audrey Blackwood's morning was still holding together. Below her, the building was not, and the man she had fired 40 minutes ago was the only person in the building who understood why. Miles Danner picked up on the second ring, which surprised Logan, because Miles Danner was not a man who picked up calls from numbers he didn't recognize before 8 in the morning. Danner. It's Logan Vance. Maintenance or I was maintenance about 40 minutes ago. Listen to me carefully. A pause. Vance. I heard about this morning. Miles, I need you to stop talking and I need you to listen, because I have maybe 2 minutes before this becomes a situation your whole team is reacting to instead of preventing. Logan was moving as he talked, crossing the lobby toward the eastern atrium, eyes tracking the ceiling, the walls, the structural columns visible at the base of the open-air shaft. Your eastern support column is under stress loading it was not designed to absorb. The HVAC containment system is redirecting pressure into the structural core. I saw the thermal readout in the basement panel. The steel is heating. When steel heats under compression load, it doesn't announce what it's about to do. It just does it. Another pause. Shorter this time. How bad? I don't know yet. That's why I need access to the mechanical room on sublevel 2, and I need someone to call the city structural emergency line right now. Not after the meeting. Not in 20 minutes now. Logan could hear Miles breathing on the other end of the line. He could hear the quality of that silence, the kind that happened when someone competent was processing something they didn't want to be true. I'll call the city line, Miles said. Come up to the security desk. I'll clear you through. Miles, I know you don't have your badge. Come up anyway. Logan was already moving. The lobby security desk was a curved structure near the main entrance. Staffed this early by 2 officers, a young woman named Priya, who Logan had spoken to maybe a dozen times over 3 years, always briefly, always about something mundane, and an older man named Garrison, who was ex-Chicago PD and took his coffee without anything in it, and had once told Logan during a slow afternoon that the worst part about working private security was that you spent most of your career hoping nothing happened. Garrison was on the phone when Logan came through the lobby. Priya looked up and her expression ran through several things, quickly recognition, confusion, something that might have been sympathy. Mr. Vance. Mr. Danner called down. She reached under the desk without being asked and produced a visitor badge. He said to give you access to B2. Thank you. Logan clipped the badge and kept moving. Behind him, Garrison's voice caught his ear low, careful, the voice of someone reading information they didn't like off a screen. Unit 7, I need you on the east atrium side. We've got a... Logan didn't hear the rest. He was already at the service corridor door. Sublevel 2 was where the building's mechanical heart lived, the primary pump systems, the pressure regulators, the main thermal management infrastructure that kept 42 floors of climate control and building systems running without anyone upstairs having to think about it. It was loud down here in a constant, layered way, the kind of noise that accumulated into a single overwhelming presence after a few minutes, the way a highway sounds when you live close enough to stop hearing individual cars. Logan moved through it with purpose, not speed, because speed in a mechanical room was how people got hurt. He had learned that early, and he had never unlearned it. He found the Eastern Pressure Management Station in less than 90 seconds. The readings were worse than they'd been on the basement display. The HVAC containment protocol triggered, Logan suspected, by a thermal anomaly detection that the system had misclassified, had engaged a cascade sequence that was systematically closing off venting pathways throughout the eastern quadrant of the building. The logic made sense if the thermal anomaly was a fire risk, contain seal, redirect. But the thermal anomaly wasn't a fire. It was structural friction, steel under load generating heat, the way metal always did when you asked it to do something it wasn't designed for. The containment protocol was treating the symptom of a structural problem as if it were a combustion risk, and in doing so, it was making the structural problem significantly worse. The pressure had to go somewhere. It was going into the column. Logan spent 4 minutes at that panel doing rapid calculations. He would have struggled to explain to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read a building the way he'd learned to read terrain. He checked load ratings against current readings, estimated the stress differential, tried to calculate the timeline. The Eastern support column was rated for a specific load tolerance that included a safety margin. That margin was, as of the readings in front of him, already compromised. The column was not going to fail immediately. Structural steel didn't work that way. It bent before it broke, warned before it went, and even then the process took time. Time was relative. 20 minutes was time. 45 seconds was also time, depending on what you needed to do with it. He figured they had somewhere between 40 and 90 minutes before the eastern face of the building experienced a failure event, serious enough to trigger cascade collapse. He also noticed as he studied the containment protocol status board, that the automated lockdown sequence had already partially engaged. He hadn't felt it happen. It must have tripped while he was in the service corridor, but the board was showing him what it had done. Elevators restricted, emergency doors sealed to prevent external pressure changes. Ventilation shafts closed. Logan stared at the elevator status. Then he thought about everyone who had been walking through the lobby with their coffee and their laptops when he'd crossed it 5 minutes ago. He got back on the phone, Miles. The containment protocol has engaged. Tell me the elevators are still running. Pause that lasted 1 second too long. They locked out about 3 minutes ago. Building management is on it. We're trying to... How many people are in the building? We don't have a full count yet. Early entry logs are showing the sound of someone talking in the background. Over 300, maybe 350. Logan closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Not because he needed to think the calculations were already running, but because 350 people was a number with weight, and he had learned a long time ago not to treat numbers with weight as if they were abstract. Okay, he said. Okay, I can manually override the pressure redirect from down here, but it's a partial fix. It'll buy time. I need you to get building management to contact the manufacturer's emergency line for the HVAC containment system. There's a master protocol reset that has to be initiated from the outside. The system won't accept internal override commands once the cascade hits stage 2, which it's already passed. We've got the city's structural team on their way. ETA 18 minutes. Miles, I need the protocol reset before they get here. Column can't hold another 18 minutes at current load. How long can it hold? Logan looked at the readings. I don't know exactly. That's the honest answer. Enough time if we move. Not enough time if we wait. He heard Miles exhale the kind of exhale that wasn't a sigh so much as a man adjusting to a situation that had just become very real very quickly. I'm on it. What do you need from here? Get your people to start moving everyone toward the western stairwells. Don't announce a full evacuation yet. If people panic and rush the stairwells, we'll have a different problem. Frame it as a precautionary measure. Keep it calm. And get me a direct line to whoever is managing the executive floors, because those people need to start moving too. That would be Audrey Blackwood's assistant. Then call her assistant. Logan. A beat. She fired you this morning. I know, Logan said. Call the assistant anyway. He worked the pressure bypass for 11 minutes. It was not elegant work. The manual override system in the sub-level 2 mechanical room was designed for emergencies that had been anticipated, with clear procedural steps and labeled controls. The current situation was an emergency that had not been anticipated. It was a convergence of a misclassified thermal event, an automated protocol that was solving the wrong problem, and a structural vulnerability that should have been caught and addressed months ago. Logan was not working from a procedure manual. He was working from his understanding of how the system was supposed to function versus how it was currently functioning, and he was making adjustments the way you made adjustments in the field, carefully, quickly, and with the full awareness that he could make things worse. He managed to redirect approximately 30% of the pressure load out of the eastern column feed and into the western distribution system, which had enough margin to absorb it without creating a secondary problem. It wasn't enough to resolve the situation. It was enough to change the timeline. 40 to 90 minutes became, in his best estimate, 60 to 110. Not great. Better than nothing. He was wiping his hands on a shop rag when his phone buzzed. Miles texting this time, come up. Need you at the security desk. Something's happened. Something's happened was not, in the context of the current morning, a phrase that Logan needed to hear. He went up anyway. Miles Danner was 51 years old, former military police, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of taking things seriously, and the kind of posture that never fully relaxed, even when the situation called for it. He was standing at the security desk, with his radio in one hand and his phone in the other, when Logan came through the service door, and he turned around with an expression that Logan had seen before, not panic, because Miles wasn't a man who panicked, but the specific look of someone who had just received information that rearranged the importance of everything else. Chloe Blackwood, Miles said. Logan stopped. Audrey's daughter. She's 9. She was here this morning. Her school is closed today, a teacher development day, so her mother brought her in early. She was supposed to stay in the executive reception area on 38 with the assistant. Miles paused. She wandered off. The security desk had 6 monitors cycling through camera feeds. Miles reached over and tapped one, expanding it. The atrium camera. The ground floor of the open-air central space, 30 feet of marble and light, and the large circular fountain that anchored the lobby's architectural identity. The fountain that Logan walked past every single day. On the feed, partially obscured by the fountain's edge, there was a small figure. A child sitting on the fountain's stone ledge, her legs dangling, looking up at the cracked ceiling arch above her with an expression of pure, bewildered curiosity. Logan looked at the arch. The crack he'd noticed 20 minutes ago had widened. From this angle, through the camera, he could also see something he hadn't been able to see from the lobby floor. The mounting bracket for the large pendant light fixture above the center of the atrium, a 300-pound installation of steel and glass that hung from a structural beam directly connected to the eastern support column, was showing visible deformation. The bracket had pulled away from the ceiling plate by what looked like 2 or 3 inches. 300 pounds. Hanging by a degrading bracket, directly above the fountain, directly above Chloe Blackwood. When was this recorded? Logan asked. It's live, Miles said. Logan was already moving. He went through the service corridor because it was faster than the lobby, came out through the east atrium maintenance access at the back wall of the ground floor space, and moved across the marble floor at a pace that was controlled without being slow. Running would spook the kid. Running would also attract attention, and he didn't want a crowd forming in the atrium right now. Chloe heard his footsteps and looked up. She was a small girl with her mother's dark hair and an expression that mixed defiance with uncertainty in proportions that shifted as he approached. She was wearing a school sweatshirt with a wolf on it and holding a granola bar she hadn't opened.
Hi,
Logan said.
Hi.
She looked at him with the evaluating directness that children sometimes had before adults trained it out of them. Are you maintenance? Used to be. He kept moving toward her, keeping his voice easy, his body language slow. What are you doing down here? Waiting, she said. For what? She considered this. I don't know. I was upstairs with Catherine, that's my mom's assistant, but Catherine had to take a phone call and I was bored. She looked around the atrium with a child's frank assessment of her surroundings. Prettier down here. There's a fountain. There is, Logan agreed. He had reached the fountain. He crouched beside it so he wasn't looming over her, which also meant he was closer to her level and could move faster if he needed to. He glanced up at the light fixture bracket with a peripheral look he hoped she didn't notice. The bracket was visibly trembling. Not swaying trembling, the fine rapid vibration of something under load it couldn't bear, like a hand holding too much weight. How long have you been sitting here? Logan asked. I don't know. A while. Your mom know where you are? No. She said it without guilt, which suggested she either hadn't thought that far ahead or had thought that far ahead and decided to deal with it later. 9-year-old logic, Chloe. He kept his voice the same. I need you to come with me right now. Not in a minute. Right now. She looked at him with fresh evaluation. Why? He could tell her the truth that the bracket above her head was about to let go and drop 300 pounds of steel and glass onto the floor they were currently sitting beside, or he could give her something she could act on without freezing. "'Cause your mom is looking for you, and she's worried," he said, "and I promised someone I'd bring you to her." It was not entirely a lie. Miles had his radio. Miles was going to call upstairs. And Audrey Blackwood, when she found out her daughter was sitting under a failing light fixture in a structurally compromised atrium, was absolutely going to be worried. Chloe considered for another second the brief, sovereign deliberation of a child who was not accustomed to being rushed, and then she slid off the fountain ledge and held out her hand. Logan took it. They walked. Not fast, fast enough. They were 8 feet from the atrium maintenance access door when the bracket gave way. The sound was enormous, not the clean crash he'd expected, but a complex, layered sequence, a snap of metal under tension releasing, the grinding shriek of the ceiling plate tearing, the dense, heavy impact of the fixture hitting the marble, followed immediately by the secondary crash of the glass housing, shattering outward in a radius that reached almost to where they had been standing. Chloe flinched violently and pressed into his side. Logan put his arm around her and kept moving. He got her through the door, into the service corridor, and down 2 steps before he allowed himself to stop. He crouched in front of her and put both hands on her shoulders, looking at her directly. Are you okay? She was shaking. Her eyes were very wide and very focused on him. That was loud, she said. Yeah, he said it was. What fell? A light fixture. It's okay, it's done. She looked at the door they'd come through, then back at him. She was 9 years old, and she was processing something that her brain didn't quite have the vocabulary for, yet the distance between what had been and what might have been. If we'd been standing there, she started. We weren't, Logan said. Come on. Miles was at the atrium access point. with two of his officers when Logan came through with Chloe. The security chief's face ran through several things in rapid sequence when he saw them: relief, followed immediately by the controlled reset of someone who had a great deal more to deal with and couldn't afford to sit with relief for long. "She's okay," Logan said. "I can see that." Miles crouched in front of Chloe. "Hi, sweetheart. You gave us a bit of a scare." "I didn't go anywhere bad," Chloe said, which was technically true if you accepted her personal definition of bad. Miles stood. He looked at Logan over her head, and his expression said everything his voice didn't. "Good timing," Miles said quietly. "Yeah." "How'd you know?" "Camera feed. The bracket." Logan glanced at the closed atrium door. Through it, faintly, he could hear the residual debris settling sounds of the fixture's aftermath. "What's the status on the upper floors?" Miles pulled him 2 steps away, while one of the officers knelt beside Chloe, producing a water bottle from somewhere and asking her careful, gentle questions that were really just a way of keeping her occupied. "We've started a soft evacuation of floors 1 through 10, framed as a precautionary drill, like you said. People are moving, mostly cooperating. But floors 11 through 42 are not moving." Miles rubbed his jaw. The automated lockdown sealed the stairwell doors between 10 and 11. Manual override requires the building management master code, which is held by Audrey Blackwood and 2 of her senior executives. Logan processed this and the emergency exit seals. Same system, same authorization. "Miles, I know. We need the code." "I know that too." Miles looked at him steadily. "Which means someone needs to get to the 40th floor. 40th floor, the executive level, where Audrey Blackwood was sitting in a board meeting that, from her perspective, had probably just been interrupted by an alarming crash from somewhere below and an urgent call from her assistant, and where she almost certainly had no idea yet how serious the situation was. Logan calculated the stairwells, the locked doors, the service shaft access points. He'd climbed building shafts in worse conditions than this, in worse buildings than this, with worse people trying to stop him. He was 38 and had a bad knee from an injury 3 years ago that his doctor called manageable, which was physician language, for it won't kill you, but it's going to remind you it exists. 40 floors of stairs on a bad knee with a time constraint was not his preferred scenario. He also didn't have another option. "I need to know about the service access shafts," Logan said. The east shaft was partially sealed by the containment protocol. "What about the west?" Miles pulled up something on his phone, the building schematics, Logan realized, which Miles apparently had on a facilities management app. Scrolled, squinted. West shaft shows as open to floor 36. Then there's an automated fire damper at 37 that may or may not have engaged. If it engaged, you'd be able to see that when you get there. They're not airtight seals, they're airflow controls. Person could get through a fire damper. "You said it, not me." Logan looked at him. "It's not as bad as it sounds," Miles said in the tone of a man who wasn't sure that was true. Logan turned back to where Chloe was sitting with the officer, drinking her water with both hands around the bottle. He looked at her for a moment. He thought, not for the first time that morning, about Ellie. Ellie at home, at school by now, in her classroom with her backpack and her careful handwriting and her absolute certainty that her father was at work doing his job and would be there at 4:30 to pick her up. Ellie, who had lost one parent to circumstances beyond anyone's control, and who had organized her sense of safety around the one remaining parent with the complete, unguarded trust of a child who hadn't learned yet to hold anything back. Logan Smith spent 3 years building a life around the promise of being there at 4:30. He was aware that going up 40 floors in a building with a compromised support column was not consistent with that promise. He was also aware that 350 people were currently sealed inside that building, and that the situation was not going to improve by itself, and that the column was not going to wait for the city structural team's 18-minute ETA, which had been revised to 23 minutes the last time Miles had checked. There were things you could walk away from, and things you couldn't. He had learned that distinction a long time ago, in a different life, in conditions where the cost of getting it wrong was paid by people who were counting on you to get it right. "Keep her here," Logan told Miles. "Get her away from the eastern side of the building, put her in the west wing, behind the security desk, somewhere reinforced." "Done." Miles paused. Logan. He looked at him. "For what it's worth," Miles said, "I never thought you didn't belong on that floor this morning." Logan picked up his tool bag from where he'd left it against the wall. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Let's just get people out." The west service shaft smelled like dust and machine oil, and the particular staleness of air that moved only when systems needed it to. Logan had been in it twice before, once to trace a ductwork vibration, once because a junction access panel on 12 had been incorrectly installed and needed reseating. Both times he'd used the ladder rungs on the shaft wall for no more than 2 or 3 floors. He started climbing at floor 1 and counted rungs. His knee announced itself around floor 8, right on schedule. Kept climbing. The shaft was narrow, not so narrow that it created claustrophobia, but narrow enough that you were always aware of the walls on either side. Emergency lighting ran at intervals along the vertical walls, small battery-powered units that cast just enough light to see the next few rungs ahead. The ambient noise of the building systems was louder. In here he could hear the pressure differentials, the stressed groaning from the east side of the building that traveled through the shared infrastructure, the mechanical protests of systems trying to do things they weren't designed to do. At floor 16, he paused long enough to send Miles a text status. The reply took 40 seconds, city structural ETA now 31 min. Column sensors showing accelerating thermal. Western stairwells clear to floor 10. Floors 1142 still locked. Chloe is safe, West Wing. 31 minutes, accelerating thermal. Logan put his phone away and kept climbing. The fire damper at 37 was engaged a hinged metal plate across the shaft opening, designed to prevent smoke passage between floors, standing at roughly 80 degrees from vertical and leaving a gap of about 16 inches at the top of the shaft opening. 16 inches was tight. Logan was not a small man. He spent 2 minutes working through it in a way that was undignified and uncomfortable, and that he was grateful nobody could see. His shoulder caught on the damper frame. His knee hit the shaft wall on the way through. He heard his jacket tear somewhere. He got through. He came out of the shaft access panel on 38 into an empty service corridor that smelled like the building stressed something metallic and sharp underneath the recycled air, the smell of systems working harder than they should. He could feel it in the floor, too. A low, steady tremor, barely perceptible. The kind of thing you'd explain away if you didn't know what you were feeling. Logan knew what he was feeling. He straightened up, pulled the torn jacket back into place, checked his tool bag. 2 more floors. He went up the internal stairway between floors. These were unlocked. The lockdown only sealing the public emergency stairwells, and came out on 40, the executive level, in the corridor behind the boardroom. Through the glass panels, he could see the meeting still in some version of progress, people around the long table, the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows beyond, the projector screen showing financial data that nobody appeared to be looking at anymore. Several people had their phones out. Audrey Blackwood was standing near the head of the table, talking to someone Logan didn't recognize, her expression controlled in the specific way that meant she was managing something she wasn't fully in control of. He could see from where he stood the east-facing windows on the far side of the boardroom. And he could see in the structural reveal panel at the base of the east wall a decorative architectural element that showed the building's exposed steel framing, a visible lateral deviation in the column profile. Eastern support column was no longer perfectly vertical. It was bending. Not by much, not by enough that you'd notice if you weren't looking. But Logan was looking, and he knew what a straight line was supposed to look like, and that column was not a straight line anymore. He pushed open the boardroom door. The room turned toward him. Audrey Blackwood looked across the table, and her expression moved through recognition, confusion, and controlled irritation in approximately 1 second. "Mr. Vance," she said. "How did you, Miss Blackwood?" Logan said. He walked directly to the east-facing glass wall, set his tool bag down, and pointed at the base of the structural reveal. "Look at that column." The room was quiet. Several people turned. Several people didn't see anything. Miles Danner came through the door behind Logan, breathing harder than Logan was, despite being a decade and a half younger, because Miles had apparently decided to find another way up and had run most of it. "Ms. Blackwood," Miles said between breaths, "your daughter is safe. I need to tell you some other things now." Audrey looked at Miles. Then she looked at Logan. Then she looked at the column. And then she looked for the first time that morning like someone who was not entirely sure she had understood the situation correctly. "Somebody explain this to me," she said, "right now." The tremor moved through the floor beneath all of them, steady and purposeful. The clock nobody had been watching until now, measuring out a timeline in the only language a building under stress had available to it. Logan turned from the window to face the room. "Okay," he said. "Here's what's happening." The boardroom had the particular silence of a room full of people who had just understood all at once that the ground beneath them was not as solid as they'd assumed. Logan stood at the east-facing glass wall and spoke clearly and without dramatics. Because dramatics were for situations where you had time to manage how people felt, and this was not that situation. Your automated containment protocol engaged approximately 40 minutes ago in response to a thermal anomaly in the eastern mechanical zone. The system classified it as a potential combustion event and began closing off venting pathways to isolate the risk. That's what the protocol is designed to do. The problem is that the thermal anomaly isn't a combustion event. It's friction heat from structural steel under load stress in the eastern support column. He pointed again at the structural reveal panel at the base of the east wall, the narrow architectural detail that exposed a section of the building's actual steel framing, something most people in this room had probably walked past hundreds of times without giving it a second look. That column is currently carrying load it was not designed to sustain. The containment protocol, by closing the venting pathways, is redirecting pressure into the structural core and making it worse. 350 people are currently sealed inside this building because the same protocol locked the emergency stairwell doors between floors 10 and 11. The authorization to unlock those doors is biometric yours, specifically, along with 2 of your senior executives. He stopped. The room was very quiet. Denton Cole, the board member who had laughed from inside the glass walls this morning while Logan was being walked out, was sitting very still at his end of the table with an expression that had lost all of its earlier amusement. The woman beside him, Logan didn't know her name. Some kind of legal or financial presence, had her hands flat on the table and was looking at the structural reveal with the focused attention of someone who had just decided to take something very seriously. Audrey stood at the head of the table. She had not moved since Logan started talking. Her coffee was on the table in front of her, forgotten, and her tablet was still in one hand, hanging at her side at an angle that suggested she'd stopped thinking about it several sentences back. Column, she said. You're telling me the support column is bending. Yes. How far? Not far enough to see from here unless you know what you're looking at. Far enough that the structural integrity timeline is measured in minutes, not hours. Someone at the table made a sound, not words, just a sharp exhaled breath, the involuntary noise of someone recalibrating. How many minutes? Audrey asked. I don't know exactly. I bought some time with a manual pressure redirect from sublevel 2 about 40 minutes ago. That helped. The city's structural team as inbound Miles has their ETA. But the column's thermal acceleration has been climbing faster than my initial estimate, which means the timeline is compressed. Miles checked his phone. City structural is now 27 minutes out. Is 27 minutes enough? Audrey asked. She was looking at Logan when she asked it, not at Miles, which told Logan something about how quickly the room's understanding of authority had shifted in the last 90 seconds. Stairwells open now and evacuation begins immediately, probably. If we wait for the structural team to arrive and assist, I don't know. Maybe. The column could hold another hour, or it could go in 15 minutes. Steel under this kind of stress doesn't give you a reliable schedule. Audrey set her tablet on the table. Where is my daughter? West Wing ground floor, Miles said. She's with Officer Tran. She's okay. Audrey absorbed this. Something moved across her face, a wave of something that was too controlled to be visible for more than a second, but which Logan caught because he was close enough and he was paying attention. It was the particular expression of a parent receiving good news in a moment when good news still has the shadow of the bad news behind it. She was in the atrium, Logan said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact that needed to be in the room. The east atrium, under the pendant fixture above the fountain. The mounting bracket failed about 20 minutes ago. We got her out before it came down. The color left Audrey's face. Not in the dramatic way that sentence looked when you wrote it. It wasn't a sudden bleaching. It was more like a light going out behind her eyes for a single second, a brief system failure that she brought back under control through what was clearly years of practice at not letting rooms see her afraid. You got her out, she said. Yes. She looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time, not as a maintenance worker in the wrong corridor, not as a problem to be managed, but as the actual person standing in front of her. You went back for her, she said. After she stopped. Yes. Another pause. The building offered one of its low tremors beneath them, steady and patient, and completely indifferent to the human drama happening 40 floors above its foundations. Cole cleared his throat. Ms. Blackwood, if what this man is saying is accurate, we need to. I know what we need to do, Denton. She said it without looking at him. She was still looking at Logan. Tell me what you need from me. The biometric override was a three-component process, Audrey's handprint, on the security panel in the executive corridor, a retinal scan on the secondary authentication unit beside the boardroom's emergency control station, and a verbal authorization code that she apparently had memorized and produced without looking it up, which told Logan she'd run this drill at least a few times. It took 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Logan stood in the corridor with Miles and watched the digital display above the emergency control panel cycle through its confirmation sequence, floor by floor, the locked indicators turning from red to green as the stairwell doors released throughout the building. It happened quickly, almost all at once, a cascade of green lights replacing red, and then the muted but audible sound of locks releasing throughout the building's core, a series of mechanical thunks transmitted through the walls. Stairwells are open, Miles said into his radio, all floors. Begin orderly evacuation west and north stairwells preferred. East stairwell avoid until further notice. This is not a drill. The response from his officers came in overlapping, clipped acknowledgments. Audrey came out of the boardroom and stood in the corridor beside Logan, watching the status panel. She had sent the executives and board members toward the north stairwell under the supervision of one of Miles's officers. She had not gone with them. You should be in that stairwell, Logan said. So should you. He didn't have a good response to that. What else needs to happen? She asked. The HVAC containment protocol needs a master reset. I can't do it from inside the building. It requires an external system access command. The manufacturer's emergency line, I know the line. She already had her phone out. I've been on it for 12 minutes. Their emergency systems team is working on a remote reset authorization. They're saying another 8 to 10 minutes. Logan looked at the structural reveal on the east wall of the corridor. The deviation in the column was visible here too, if you knew where to look. He thought it might be slightly more pronounced than when he'd first seen it in the boardroom, which was either real or his anxiety doing things with his perception. He decided to operate as if it was real. There's something else, he said. Audrey looked at him. The building has seismic stabilizers in the foundation, Logan said. Hydraulic systems installed about 6 years ago after the city updated its seismic requirements for structures this height. They're designed to redistribute structural load during a seismic event shift weight away from compromised points to compensate. I looked at the specs when I first started here because I wanted to understand every system in the building. You read the structural specifications when you took a maintenance job. I read everything. She considered him for a moment. And the stabilizers could potentially redistribute enough load off the eastern column to prevent a failure event while we wait for the structural team. Or until the protocol reset lets the HVAC system decompress correctly. He paused. Theoretically. The stabilizers have never been activated manually under these conditions. They're designed for seismic response the building moves. The hydraulics compensate. Triggering them against a static structural load rather than a dynamic seismic one is, he chose the next word with care, untested. Untested as in nobody's ever tried it, or untested as in it might not work. Both. And there's a third possibility if the column has already passed a certain stress threshold, the hydraulic activation could cause a sudden load shift that accelerates the failure instead of preventing it. Audrey looked at him steadily. So it could save the building or it could bring it down faster. In a worst-case scenario, yes. What's your read? He thought about it. Not performing the consideration, actually running the calculation, the way he'd learned to run calculations when the cost of being wrong was not abstract. Load rating, thermal differential, current deviation, time elapsed, the manual redirect he'd done in the sublevel, which had bought maybe a 30% improvement, the protocol reset that was still 8 minutes away, the structural team that was still 27 minutes out. My read is that if the protocol reset happens on schedule, we probably don't need the stabilizers, he said. If it doesn't happen on schedule, we might need them. And if the column's thermal acceleration continues at the current rate, the window for using them closes regardless. Once the steel reaches a certain threshold, the hydraulic load shift won't be able to compensate for what's already happened. Audrey processed this with the focused attention of someone who had made a great many high-stakes decisions and understood that the quality of the decision mattered less than the speed at which it was made when the situation was time-sensitive. Where is the stabilizer activation panel, sublevel 1? Physical panel, it's not networked. It's a direct mechanical trigger system. Somebody has to be there in person. She looked at the stairwell door. Then, let's go, she said. Ms. Blackwood Audrey. She said it without breaking stride toward the stairwell. We're past titles. They went down together, Audrey, Logan, and Miles, who refused to go to the exit stairwell with his officers, on the grounds that someone needed to coordinate internally, and that someone was going to be him. The north stairwell was moving. They could hear it. The organized sound of hundreds of people descending in the controlled urgency of an evacuation that had been, so far, staying on the right side of orderly. Voices, footsteps, the occasional sound of someone telling someone else to keep moving. It's fine. Watch the step. At floor 22, they passed a bottleneck, a cluster of people from the open-plan floors, 40 or 50 of them compressed into the landing, moving slower than the floors above and below. Miles pushed ahead and started directing traffic, his voice clear and authoritative without being aggressive, and the cluster loosened. Logan and Audrey moved through it. Somewhere around floor 17, Audrey said, without breaking stride, "How did you know about the bracket?" Logan glanced at her, the camera feed. Miles showed me. "You saw a bracket on a security camera and knew it was about to fail. I saw the deformation, the pull away from the ceiling plate. A bracket under normal load doesn't show visible separation like that." She was quiet for a few steps. "How long did you have? Between when you saw it and when it came down?" "I don't know exactly. A few minutes, maybe less." "How long was she sitting there before you saw the feed?" "I don't know that either." Audrey's jaw tightened, and she looked straight ahead at the stairwell wall, and she didn't say anything else for several floors. Logan understood. There was a calculation she was running that had nothing to do with load ratings or hydraulic systems. It was the calculation every parent made when they understood how close something had come, how small the margin had been, how different the morning could have been if any one variable had shifted slightly. It was a calculation that didn't have a useful output, because the output was just the same fact repeated. It didn't happen, but it could have. He'd run that calculation himself more times than he could count. He'd learned that the only thing to do with it was to file it somewhere and keep moving. "She's safe," he said. "I know." Audrey's voice was controlled. "I know she is." They kept going. Sublevel 1 was a different space from Sublevel 2, less operational, more foundational. Where Sublevel 2 housed the building's active mechanical systems, Sublevel 1 was the structural layer, the place where the building connected to its own footprint. The ceiling was lower. The concrete was exposed. The air was cooler and carried a faint dampness that didn't exist in the upper floors. Stabilizer activation panel was on the north wall, behind a yellow safety enclosure with a manual latch and a placard that read "Seismic Stabilization System. Authorized personnel only do not activate except in emergency." Logan opened the enclosure. The panel was not complicated. It was designed to be operated under stress, by people who might be disoriented or frightened, in conditions where fine motor control was not guaranteed. Large controls, clear labels, a primary activation switch behind a safety cover, a load distribution selector with 3 positions, and a manual pressure gauge that showed the current hydraulic reservoir status. The gauge showed full. "Good," Logan said, mostly to himself. "What does full mean?" Audrey asked. She was standing beside him, close enough to see the panel clearly. "It means the system hasn't been passively bleeding pressure. The hydraulics are ready to actuate." He studied the load distribution selector. This is the one that matters. 3 positions seismic standard, which distributes load evenly across all 4 quadrants. Eastern bias, which redirects load away from the east face and onto the west and north columns. And foundation lock, which essentially anchors the building's weight distribution to its central core and minimizes movement. Which one do we want? Eastern bias. We want to take load off the compromised column and move it somewhere that can handle it. And if we're wrong about the column's status, if the column has already gone past a critical threshold, the eastern bias load shift, he stopped. "Say it," Audrey said, "could transfer load faster than the western columns can absorb it. If the west columns are also carrying above standard loads from the protocol-directed pressure, a sudden additional transfer from the east could create a secondary stress event. On the west side, yes, so we could fix the east and break the west. In a worst-case scenario." She looked at the panel. She looked at the load distribution selector and its 3 positions and the yellow safety cover over the activation switch. She looked at the pressure gauge showing full. "Where are we on the protocol reset?" she asked Miles. Miles was on his phone. "Manufacturer says 6 minutes. They're in the final authorization sequence. And the structural team? 24 minutes. Audrey looked at Logan. "What would you do?" she asked. "This were your building." He thought about it for exactly as long as the situation permitted. I'd wait the 6 minutes, he said. If the protocol reset happens on schedule and the HVAC system starts decompressing correctly, the column load starts reducing on its own. We activate the stabilizers as a secondary measure to support the process rather than as an emergency intervention, which is a much lower risk trigger scenario. He paused. But I'd have my hand on this switch the whole time. She nodded once. Then that's what we do. 6 minutes was not a long time in most contexts. In the sub-level 1 structural chamber of a 42-story building with a bending support column, 6 minutes was geological. Logan stood at the panel with his hand near the activation switch and watched the structural feed that Miles had pulled up on his tablet, a real-time sensor output from the building's internal monitoring system that showed column thermal readings, load differentials, and deviation measurements. The numbers updated every 30 seconds. At minute 1, the eastern column deviation reading was 0.34 degrees from vertical. At minute 2, it was 0.37. That's normal variance, Logan said when Audrey looked at the number. Thermal expansion and the natural load cycling of the building. Doesn't mean acceleration. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself as much as me. Little bit, he admitted. She almost smiled. It wasn't the right moment for smiling, and she didn't quite get there. But it was close, a small crack in the controlled surface. The kind of thing that only happened when someone was either very relaxed or very scared, and she was clearly not very relaxed. At minute 3, Miles's radio produced a burst of overlapping voices that he sorted through with practiced efficiency, answering and redirecting and acknowledging. The evacuation was proceeding. Most floors were clear. The east stairwell had been avoided as instructed. A few people had needed assistance, an older woman on 29 with a mobility issue, 2 people in the 22nd floor conference room who hadn't received the initial notification, but the officers had reached them. Chloe was still in the West Wing with Officer Tran, apparently asking with some regularity when her mother was coming. Tell her soon, Audrey said when Miles relayed this. I'll tell her that, Miles said. At minute 4, the eastern column deviation read 0.41 degrees. Logan's hand was on the panel. Logan, Audrey said. Not yet. How do you know? I don't, but 6 minutes is 6 minutes and we have 2 left. The difference between activating now and activating at 6 minutes is the building moved. Not a tremor this time, a genuine lateral shift, maybe 3 or 4 centimeters, the kind of movement that was perceptible as movement rather than vibration. The lights in the sub-level flickered. Somewhere in the mechanical systems above them, something produced a sound like a very large, very tense cable releasing tension, a deep bass thrum that traveled through the concrete floor. The deviation reading jumped to 0.58 degrees in the next sensor cycle. Now, Audrey said. Logan flipped the safety cover. His phone buzzed. He stopped. Miles grabbed his own phone, looked at the screen, and his expression changed. Protocol reset is executing, Miles said. They're in. The HVAC containment is releasing. Everyone in the room stopped breathing for approximately 2 seconds. Logan looked at the thermal reading on the sensor feed. For a moment, maybe 20 seconds, maybe 30, nothing changed. The numbers sat where they were, and Logan was very aware of the activation switch under his finger, and the difference between the eastern bias setting and every other outcome, and the fact that he did not actually know with certainty what the right call was. He had an educated assessment. He had experience in calculation, and the thing that years of doing difficult things in difficult conditions had built in him, that wasn't quite instinct, but wasn't quite reasoning, either some combination of both, that his old team leader had once called reading the room at scale. He was reading the room at scale right now, and the room was 42 floors of steel and glass, and 350 people, and one 9-year-old girl waiting for her mother in the West Wing. The eastern column thermal reading dropped 0.8 degrees. Small, but real. The protocol is releasing, Logan said. Is that enough? Audrey asked. Give it 30 seconds. The reading dropped another 0.4 degrees. The deviation reading stabilized 0.58, 0.57, 0.58, 0.57, holding in a narrow range that wasn't improving but wasn't worsening. Logan exhaled. It's holding, he said. The decompression is reducing the load. The column is not in immediate acceleration. The room reorganized itself around this information. Miles was on his radio. Audrey put both hands flat on the panel casing and leaned on them for a moment, her head down, and Logan looked away because it was the kind of moment that belonged to her. After a few seconds, she straightened. The structural team, she said. When they get here, They'll need to assess the full column condition before anyone returns to the eastern quadrant floors, Logan said. The east stairwell probably needs to stay closed until they complete that assessment. Depending on what they find, there may be remediation work before those floors are reoccupied. How long could be days, could be longer, she nodded. Processing it. Not happy about it, but processing it, which was what the situation called for. Stabilizers, she said. I'd still activate them. Eastern bias as a support measure while the decompression finishes. It's lower risk now that the primary load is starting to reduce, and it gives the column additional support while we wait for the structural team. She looked at the panel. Walk me through it. He walked her through it. She listened the way she listened to everything completely, without interruption, filing what mattered and setting aside what didn't. When he finished, she reached past him, moved the load distribution selector to eastern bias, checked the pressure gauge one more time, and then looked at him. Together, she said. It was an odd thing to say, and he wasn't entirely sure why she said it, but he put his hand on the activation switch alongside hers, and they engaged it together, which was operationally unnecessary, and which neither of them acknowledged. The hydraulic system came awake below them, an enormous mechanical sound, deep and resonant, traveling up through the foundation itself, and the building shuddered once as the load redistribution engaged. Not a collapse shudder, a settling shudder, the kind that came from something large and heavy adjusting its weight, finding a new balance point. The deviation reading moved 0.57, 0.54, 0.51. Not back to zero, the column had been stressed, and stress left marks, and the structural team was going to have opinions about what happened next. The number was moving in the right direction for the first time all morning, and Logan stood in the sublevel of a building that was, against some odds, still standing, and allowed himself to feel what he usually didn't let himself feel during a situation, the specific bodily relief of a thing that didn't go wrong. His phone showed 9:47 a.m. He thought about Ellie. He thought about 4:30. Ms. Black. He stopped. Audrey, you need to get to your daughter. She was already moving toward the door. They found Chloe in the West Wing security room, sitting on a rolling chair that she'd been spinning slowly, eating a second granola bar that Officer Tran had apparently produced from somewhere, and delivering to Officer Tran what appeared to be a detailed account of her personal opinions about her school's cafeteria food. When the door opened and she saw her mother, she stopped mid-sentence, slid off the chair, and crossed the room in a way that was not quite running, but was as fast as a 9-year-old could move while maintaining the dignity of not running. Audrey went to her knees on the concrete floor without any apparent concern for her suit, and she put her arms around her daughter, and she held her in the way that parents held children after close calls, not the casual embrace of a normal reunion, but something tighter and more complete, a physical accounting of someone who was still there. Logan stood in the doorway. Chloe's voice was muffled against her mother's shoulder. You smell like the basement. I've been in the basement. Why? Because that's where I needed to be. A pause. Chloe pulled back enough to look at her mother's face. Are we going home? Soon. We're going to wait outside for a little while first.
Is the building okay?
Audrey looked at her daughter. Then briefly she looked at Logan. It will be, she said. They went outside. The emergency crews had established a perimeter on the street fire department, city structural response, 2 ambulances staged for precaution, a police detail managing the crowd of evacuated employees gathering on the sidewalk. The morning had turned into one of those crisp, clear days that the city occasionally produced in contrast to its usual self. The kind of day where the light had a particular quality that made everything look slightly more real than usual. Logan came out last, through the maintenance exit on the building's north face, and stood in the cold air and looked up at Sterling Crest Tower. 42 floors. The east face, from out here, showed no visible indication of what had been happening inside it, was the same glass and steel facade it had always been, reflecting the morning sky back at itself with perfect indifference. Buildings didn't look different on the outside when they were struggling on the inside. That was the thing about structures, the failure was always interior before it was ever visible. He thought that might be true of more than buildings. Miles came and stood beside him, and they both looked up at the tower for a while without talking. The way 2 people who had spent a difficult morning doing difficult things sometimes stood together without the need to discuss it. City structural team just arrived, Miles said eventually. Saw. They're going to want to talk to you. I know. And HR is going to have some questions. About this morning. About the whole, Miles gestured vaguely, encompassing the building, the emergency vehicles, the hundreds of employees milling on the sidewalk, the morning in general. Yeah, Logan said. He was thinking about his phone. He needed to call the school not because anything had happened to him, but because he'd learned a long time ago that it was better to call and have nothing to report than to not call and have someone else make the report. He needed to know that Ellie was in class and was fine and was going to be at the after-school program at 4:30, the same as always. He pulled out his phone. He had a text from an unknown number sent 8 minutes ago. This is Audrey Blackwood. I got your number from the facilities records. I know this isn't the time or the circumstances for this, but I need you to know that I understand I was wrong this morning. Not just about the building. About you. I'm sorry. AB, he read it twice. Then he called the school, and the school told him Ellie was in class and had eaten her breakfast and had received a gold star on her spelling test, which she'd been working on all week. He thanked them and hung up. He put his phone in his pocket. Across the emergency perimeter, through the organized chaos of the response scene, he could see Audrey sitting on the back step of one of the ambulances with Chloe beside her. Chloe appeared to be explaining something at length, using her hands, in the way she'd been explaining things to Officer Tran earlier. Audrey was listening with the complete, focused attention of a woman who had spent the morning being very afraid of losing this person, and was now very deliberately not taking a single sentence for granted. Logan looked at them for a moment. Then he turned to meet the city's structural team, who were walking toward him with clipboards and questions and the efficient urgency of people who had a lot of work to do and were grateful the situation had left them something to work with. He had some things to tell them. He figured he'd start with the column. The city structural team was led by a woman named Dr. Petra Salsas, 53 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of unhurried precision in her movements that came from spending a career around things that failed catastrophically when you rushed. She listened to Logan for 11 minutes without interrupting, which was longer than most people listen to anything. And when he finished, she asked 4 very specific questions that told him she had understood everything he'd said and was now verifying the parts that mattered most. The manual pressure redirect you performed in sublevel 2, what was the valve sequence? Logan told her. And the stabilizer activation, you selected eastern bias distribution? Current pressure gauge was showing full reservoir. I estimated the western columns had sufficient margin to absorb the transferred load, given the partial decompression from the protocol reset. What was your basis for that estimate? The building specs I read when I started the maintenance job. Western columns are rated 30% above the eastern face, due to the prevailing wind load requirements on the side of the city. If both were carrying standard loads, the margin was there. If the protocol redirect had been pushing elevated load into the west as well, it was a different calculation, but the western thermal sensors weren't showing stress accumulation, only the east. Dr. Salas wrote something on her clipboard. Then she looked up at him with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between people who understood what they were talking about and people who thought they did. What's your engineering background? She asked. I don't have one. Officially. She studied him for a moment. Unofficially? 12 years doing things in conditions where the structural integrity of whatever I was standing on was frequently a relevant concern. She held his gaze for another second, then made a note. We're going to need you available for the next several hours, she said. You've been inside every part of this building's mechanical infrastructure in a way my team hasn't. I'd rather have you walking with us than reconstructing it from documentation. I can do that. Your employment status is complicated this morning, Logan said, but I can do that. She almost smiled. Good. Start with sublevel 2. I want to see the pressure redirect valve configuration in person before we run any new assessments. What followed was 4 hours that Logan would later struggle to describe in any coherent, linear way. Because it didn't move in a line, it moved the way complex crisis response always moved, in overlapping circles of activity that required you to be in multiple places at once, and to hold in your head a continuously updating picture of a situation that kept changing. He walked the sublevel mechanical rooms with Dr. Salas's team, showing them the valve configurations, the pressure readings, the thermal sensor outputs that had been accumulating all morning. He walked the structural reveal panels on floors 12, 24, and 38, pointing out the deformation indicators he'd identified, watching the structural engineers photograph and measure and discuss in the careful technical language of people who would eventually produce a report that nobody outside their field would fully understand. He answered questions about the HVAC containment protocol's cascade sequence with a precision that made two of the younger engineers exchange a look that he chose not to interpret. The eastern column's condition, once the structural team completed their initial assessment, was characterized by Dr. Salas as significant but non-critical, which was better than the morning had suggested was possible, and worse than the building's owners were going to want to hear. The column had experienced thermal stress deformation at a level that required remediation before the eastern quadrant floors could be safely reoccupied. That remediation was going to involve temporary support structures, a detailed inspection of connecting beams and floor plates on floors 8 through 22, and a complete overhaul of the HAA containment protocol's classification logic. Dr. Salas's estimate, delivered to Miles and the building management representative who had arrived from corporate, was 4 to 6 weeks before full eastern quadrant reoccupancy. The building management representative looked like he'd been told the building needed to be demolished. Logan thought 4 to 6 weeks was a reasonable outcome for a morning that had, at several points, been tracking towards significantly worse alternatives. He didn't say this out loud. He was in the sub-level 2 mechanical room at just past 1 in the afternoon, reviewing pressure normalization data with one of Dr. Salas's engineers, a young man named Trevors, who had been asking Logan increasingly detailed questions about the manual valve system, with the barely concealed enthusiasm of someone who had spent his career studying things that had already failed, and was now talking to someone who'd worked on one while it was still happening when Miles appeared at the mechanical room door. "Someone wants to talk to you," Miles said. "The structural team has me for another." "Not the structural team." Logan looked at him. Miles's expression was neutral in the specific way it got when he was carefully not having an opinion about something. "She's been out there for about 40 minutes, Miles said. "She was going to come find you herself, but I told her you were with the structural engineers, and she decided to wait. Which, for what it's worth, is not something she normally does." Logan set down the readout he'd been holding. "Trevors," he said to the engineer, "the pressure normalization sequence is documented on the panel log going back to 1014. That's when the protocol reset fully engaged. Everything before that is the stress accumulation phase you'll want to cross-reference with the thermal sensor timestamps." Trevors was already writing this down. Logan followed Miles out. Audrey was waiting in the service corridor outside the mechanical room, standing against the wall, with her arms crossed and her phone in one hand, not looking at the phone, just holding it the way people held things when they needed something to do with their hands, but didn't actually want to do anything. She had changed out of the charcoal suit at some point and was wearing what appeared to be a company-branded emergency jacket over her blouse, which suggested someone had offered it, and she had accepted without making it a thing, which Logan filed as information without deciding what to do with it. She looked up when he came through the door. "Chloe's upstairs," she said. "Catherine, my assistant, came back for her. She's fine. She's annoyed about missing school, which I'm choosing to take as a good sign." "It is," Logan said. A brief silence. The service corridor was functional and indifferent around them concrete walls, utility lighting, the ambient mechanical noise of a building that was, tentatively, going about its business. "Structural team says 4 to 6 weeks, Audrey said. "That's a reasonable estimate for what the column needs. 4 to 6 weeks of Eastern Quadrant closure affects about 200 employees who work in that zone. Some of them can relocate to other floors temporarily. Some can work remotely. The conference facilities, the client-facing spaces on 16 and 17, those are going to be a problem." She said this in a tone that was informational rather than self-pitying, the voice of someone inventorying damage rather than lamenting it. "The board is going to have concerns. The board should be glad the building is standing." She looked at him. "That came out," he started. "No. You're right." She said it simply and without qualification. "They should be glad the building is standing. Several of them were in it this morning." She paused. "So were 348 other people. I've been thinking about that number. 348. That's the confirmed count of employees who were inside when the lockdown engaged." "Chloe." She looked at the wall, then back at him. 349 people who went to work this morning, not knowing that the building they work in had a problem that I didn't know about either, and that the one person who did know about it was someone I threw off the floor." She let that sit for a second. "I've been thinking about what that morning looked like from your end. You came upstairs and you were right to come upstairs. The ticket was in the system, and the problem was real, and you were following your instincts in a situation where your instincts turned out to be completely accurate. And what happened was that I saw a maintenance worker where I didn't expect one, and I made a very fast decision about what that meant. Logan didn't say anything. I wasn't cruel, she said. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this conversation where I perform more guilt than I actually feel, and I don't want to do that. I wasn't cruel, but I was wrong, and I was wrong in a way that had consequences I didn't see because I wasn't looking for them. And that matters to me, she stopped. What I'm saying badly is that I'm sorry. Not the text I sent earlier, which was also genuine but was also a text, which is a limited medium for the actual thing I'm trying to say. Logan looked at her for a moment. He'd spent 3 years being invisible in this building. He'd spent those 3 years in a place where he was doing a job he was good at and where his actual background was irrelevant, because he'd made it irrelevant. He hadn't resented it. He'd chosen it, the invisibility, the routine, the quiet. He'd chosen it because it was the shape of the life he needed to be building for Ellie, and because the life that had come before it had required him to be seen in ways that had costs he was still accounting for. He didn't have a practiced response to being apologized to by someone with the authority to have done what she'd done. I know, he said, which wasn't acceptance or rejection, just acknowledgement. And I know what the morning looked like from your end, too. You had investors arriving and a board meeting running and a maintenance worker in a corridor he wasn't supposed to be in, and you made the call that made sense, given what you knew. You couldn't have known what I knew. I could have listened. Maybe, maybe not. Most people in your position wouldn't have. I'm not most people in my position. He considered her. No, he said, you're not. She studied him with the same directness she'd been bringing to every exchange they'd had since the boardroom. He was starting to understand simply how she operated straight at the thing, no decorative approach. He appreciated that more than he would have expected. I want to ask you something, she said. Okay, Miles told me not in those words, and not directly, but I know, Miles, that when you found out Chloe was in the atrium, you didn't hesitate. You went immediately, without being asked, without it being your job, without having any particular reason to do anything for me or my daughter after the morning we'd had. He waited. Why? She asked. The honest answer was complicated, and he was standing in a service corridor in a building that had been under structural stress 4 hours ago, so he gave her the honest answer rather than the simple one. I have a daughter, he said. She's 8. Her name is Ellie. He paused. When Miles showed me the camera feed and I understood what I was looking at, a child, alone, under a failing bracket, it was not a complicated moment. It wasn't about you. It wasn't about the morning. It was about the fact that she was a child who was alone and in danger, and I was the person in the room who understood the danger. He stopped. I've spent a lot of years being the person in the room who understood the danger. It doesn't turn off because the shift ends. Audrey was quiet for a moment. You were a SEAL, she said. It wasn't a question. Miles had clearly given her that piece too. 12 years, rescue operations, high-risk extraction primarily. Emergency response in situations where conventional response wasn't available or had already failed. Processed this in silence. He could see her reorganizing the morning around this information, not just the events, but her understanding of the person she'd been dealing with. He recognized that reorganization because he'd seen it before. In other contexts, when people who had made assumptions about him encountered information that the assumptions hadn't accounted for. You were very calm, she said the whole time. Even in the boardroom when she paused. You were very calm. Calm is a practice. It's not a personality trait. He thought about how to say the next part. In the work I used to do, the most dangerous thing you could do was panic before you understood the situation. Panic made you act on incomplete information. Understanding the situation, even a bad one, was always the priority. Everything else followed from that. Is that something you learn or something you are? Both. Some people can't learn it. Some people learn it so well it becomes permanent. He looked at the wall. Problem with it becoming permanent is that it doesn't distinguish between situations where it's useful and situations where it's just how you move through the world. Sometimes that's not great. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. The maintenance job, she said, after the SEALs. After the SEALs, after Ellie's mother. I needed something I could do reliably, in one place, with known hours, that used enough of what I know to be satisfying and left enough of the rest behind that I could be home at 4:30. 4:30. That's when her program ends. Audrey looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her phone, and her expression shifted in a way that he couldn't read. It's 1:40, she said. I know. You have enough time. I know that too. He made it to the after-school program at 4:27. which was 3 minutes early, which was rare enough that the program coordinator, a tired, cheerful woman named Mrs. Okafor, who had known Logan for 2 years, and who was one of approximately 4 people in his non-building life he talked to with any regularity, looked up from her desk with mild surprise when he came through the door. "Early day?" she said. "Complicated day," he said. She gave him the look she gave him when she suspected there was more to the sentence and had decided not to push on it, which was one of the things he appreciated about Mrs. Okafor. Ellie was in the art corner, working on something with colored pencils that appeared to involve a large orange animal of indeterminate species and a great deal of enthusiasm. She was wearing the blue sweater with the hole near the cuff that Logan kept meaning to sew and kept not getting to, and her hair was coming out of its ponytail in the specific way it always did by mid-afternoon, 2 pieces escaping on the left side. She looked up when he came in, and her face did the thing it did not excitement exactly. More like a complete, uncomplicated satisfaction, the face of someone whose world had just arranged itself correctly. "You're early," she said. "A little. What happened?" "I'll tell you about it on the way home." She capped her pencils with the precision of a child who took her arts seriously and packed them into their case and slid off the chair. "Was it a big thing?" she asked. He thought about the morning, the vibration in the wall, the corridor on the 38th floor, the bracket above the fountain, the shaft climb, the deviation reading, and the hydraulic thrum of the stabilizers coming awake, and the number dropping from 0.58 to 0.51. "Medium, big," he said. She took his hand as they went through the door, which she was starting to do less as she got older, not because she didn't want to, he thought, but because she was becoming aware that it was something younger kids did, and she was developing opinions about what 8-year-olds did and didn't do. He held it anyway, and she let him. They walked 2 blocks before she said, "Did you get in trouble?" "Why do you ask that?" "You have the face." He looked down at her. "What face?" "The one where you're deciding how to say something." He thought about lying, which he didn't do, and thought about simplifying, which he sometimes did, and settled on the version that was accurate, without being more than she needed. "I lost my job this morning," he said, "but then something happened, and I might get it back in a different way. Complicated. But nobody got hurt, and the building is okay, and I was home at 4:30. She processed this for half a block. "The building is okay," she said. "What happened to the building?" "It had a problem. I helped fix it. Was it dangerous?" He thought about the shaft climb. "Atrium. The column deviation reading, a little," he said. She tightened her grip on his hand very briefly, not from fear, he thought, but from the wordless communication that existed between parents and children who'd been through difficult things and had learned to talk around the edges of them. "Okay," she said. They walked the rest of the way home talking about the orange animal, which turned out to be a fox, and about her spelling test, and about whether they had enough pasta for dinner or whether they needed to stop at the store, which they did. So they stopped at the store, and Logan bought pasta and sauce and the specific brand of sparkling water that Ellie had recently decided was her preference, and they walked home in the early evening that was coming earlier now as the fall deepened, and none of it was remarkable or dramatic or the kind of thing anyone would make a story out of. It was exactly the kind of thing Logan Vance had rebuilt his life to protect. Call from Audrey came 3 days later. He had been expecting it, in the way you expected things you hadn't decided how to respond to, yet knowing it was coming, not quite knowing where you'd land when it arrived. He was in the apartment. Early morning, Ellie already at school, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the structural remediation report that Dr. Salas's team had sent him as a professional courtesy after the city assessment, which had been a gesture he hadn't expected and which he'd read twice. His phone rang, and her name was on the screen she'd texted once in the intervening days, a brief message confirming that all employees had been notified of the Eastern Quadrant closure and the temporary relocation arrangements, and he picked up. "Logan, Audrey, are you somewhere you can talk?" "Yes. I have something to ask you. I want to be direct about it, because I think you're someone who prefers that." "I am. I'm creating a new division," she said. "Global Safety and Crisis Response. The morning we had what happened with the HVAC protocol, the column, the lockdown, that's not just a this building problem. Sterling Crest has 14 properties in 8 cities. Every one of them has systems that interact with each other in ways that nobody with the right knowledge is currently monitoring in an integrated way. The maintenance teams are excellent at what they do, but what you did on Tuesday was different. You understood the building as a system, not as a set of separate components, and you were able to make decisions under pressure with incomplete information and a time constraint. She paused. I want someone running a division that does that for every property we own, she said. Someone who understands buildings the way you understand them, who understands risk, who can build a team and a protocol that means the next time something goes wrong, because something will always go wrong, we know about it before it becomes a crisis. Logan held the phone. That's a senior executive position, he said. Yes, I'm a former maintenance worker. You're a former Navy SEAL with 12 years of high-risk operational experience and what appears to be a comprehensive understanding of structural and mechanical systems in large commercial buildings. The maintenance worker part was a choice you made for specific reasons that I now understand better than I did on Tuesday morning. He was quiet for a moment. What's the salary? He asked. She named a number that he sat with for several seconds. That's not necessary, he said. It's the rate for the position. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm filling a role that needs to be filled, and you're the best person I've found for it, including the search I was running before Tuesday. You were already looking? I've been looking for 8 months. Nobody had the right combination. A brief pause. You have it. Logan looked at the structural remediation report on the table in front of him, at the technical language that described what had happened and what needed to happen, and in the margins of which he'd been making notes for 2 days about things the report hadn't covered and probably should have. Something I want, he said. I assumed there would be, she said, and he could hear that she meant it as a recognition rather than a complication. Every employee in every Sterling Crest property maintenance workers, cleaning staff, security, administrative, executive, everyone has formal authority to report a safety concern and have it reviewed by someone with the technical knowledge to assess it, not routed through a chain that can slow walk it or dismiss it because the person filing it doesn't have the right job title. Directly to the safety division with a required response timeline. She was quiet. If I'd been able to file that report 2 days earlier and have it reviewed by someone who understood what I was describing, Tuesday morning probably looks different, Logan said. Problem wasn't that the information didn't exist. Problem was that the information didn't have a clear path to the people who could act on it. You're asking me to build a reporting structure that gives equal weight to a maintenance worker's safety concern and a senior executive's. Yes. Another silence. Longer. That's going to create friction, she said. The executive team is going to have opinions. I know. Some of those opinions are going to be loud. I know that, too. He waited. He had learned a long time ago that certain silences were just people catching up to the place they were already going, and that the right response to those silences was to leave them alone. Okay, Audrey said. Okay, you'll think about it. Or, okay, it's done. I'll have legal draft the reporting structure into the division charter. A beat. You were right about the column this morning, and you were right about the corridor on Tuesday. You're right about this, too. Another pause, shorter. I don't enjoy being wrong, but I'd rather know I am than not. Logan looked at the table. I'll need to think about the position, he said. I know. Take the time you need. It'll be a few days. That's fine. Logan, she stopped. Yeah, the safety reporting structure. Equal access thing. She seemed to be choosing her words with some care. That's not just a structural policy change. That's a culture change. That's going to require someone to model it from the inside, to make it real rather than a document in the charter. I know. I'm saying that the person who runs this division needs to be someone who actually believes it, not someone performing the belief. I know that too, Logan said. It's why I asked for it before I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. 2 days? She said. 2 days, he confirmed. He thought he heard something in her voice, not quite a smile, but the sound of a conversation that had landed somewhere both people were willing to be. He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he filed it in the same place he'd been filing several things about the last 3 days, and told himself he'd sort through it when the situation was less complicated. The situation, he suspected, was going to be complicated for a while. He hung up and poured himself more coffee and sat at the table with the structural remediation report and his notes in the margins, and he thought about 14 properties in 8 cities and the systems that connected them, and about the reporting structure he'd asked for, and about what it meant to build something rather than just maintain it. He thought about Ellie, who would be home at 4:30. He thought about the morning in the corridor, the vibration in the wall, the badge being taken, the walk to the elevator with keys standing beside him. He thought about the fact that he'd gone back, not because of what it would mean or what it would lead to, Because there had been a child alone in a dangerous place, and he had been the person who knew it. And the building had been full of people who didn't know what was happening to them, and there had been no real alternative, not for him, not for who he was in the parts of himself that were not maintenance uniform and canvas tool bag and 4:30 pickup. He thought about what Miles had said in the service corridor, hours ago now, which was that he'd never thought Logan didn't belong on that floor. He thought about belonging. He thought of belonging. He thought the difference between where you were placed and where you stood. Then he picked up the structural remediation report and read the section on column support remediation for the third time, because he had thoughts about the proposed timeline and whether it adequately accounted for the secondary stress indicators on the connecting beams at floors 12 and 13, and because thinking about problems he understood was always, for Logan Vance, the most reliable way to feel like himself. Outside, the city did what it always did. Inside the apartment, it was quiet in the specific way of a space that had a child in it for part of the day and a person in it for all of it, a space that had been shaped by the requirements of a particular life, and bore their mark in the blue sweater hanging on the chair, and the colored pencils on the counter, and the sparkling water in the fridge. Logan read, somewhere across the city, Sterling Crest Tower stood in the morning light with the city's structural team's temporary supports in place along its eastern face, looking from the outside the way it always had glass and steel, 42 floors, a name on the skyline. Still standing. For now, that was enough. He said yes on the second day. Not the first, because the first day he spent doing what he always did, with decisions that mattered sitting with it, testing it from different angles, looking for the parts that didn't hold up under honest scrutiny. He made a list on paper, which was something Ellie had once caught him doing, and asked about, and he'd told her it was how he thought, and she'd said that was weird, but okay, and he'd agreed on both counts. The list had two sides. One side was the reasons to take the position. The other side was the reasons not to. The reasons not to were mostly fear, which he identified as fear, and therefore discounted not because fear was always wrong, but because fear was only useful information when it was pointing at something real. The fears on his list were pointing at change, at visibility, at the possibility of being seen in ways he'd spent 3 years avoiding. Those were not good reasons. Those were the reasons a person chose invisibility over impact, and called it caution when it was actually just comfort. The reasons to take it were simpler. He was good at it. The work mattered. 349 people on a Tuesday morning. And the reporting structure, the thing he'd asked for before he'd agreed to anything which was not a small thing, and which he found himself caring about in a way that surprised him with its intensity. He called Audrey at 7:43 in the morning. "I'll take it," he said. A brief pause on her end. Not surprised more, the pause of someone who had prepared for both outcomes and was now organizing around the one that had arrived. "Good," she said. "HR will send you the paperwork today. I'd like you to start the week after next, which gives you time to minus. I need one thing before I sign. The reporting structure is already in the charter draft. I told you not that. That's done. I trust that." He looked at his coffee cup. "I need you to reinstate the maintenance team's priority reporting protocol. The ticket I filed 2 days before Tuesday was marked reviewed and deprioritized by building management before it ever reached anyone with a technical background to assess it. That's a process failure, not a personnel failure. But it needs to be fixed before I start, because I'm not building a safety division on top of a foundation that has the same gap." She was quiet for a moment. "That's outside the division charter," she said.
"I know.
"It's a building management operations change. But it's connected, and it matters, and I'd rather say it now than discover in 6 months that I'm running a safety division that can identify risks after the fact and can't prevent them from being buried before they reach us." Another silence. Shorter. "Done," she said. "I'll have operations update the protocol by end of week. Priority maintenance flags go directly to engineering review within 24 hours. A beat. Anything else?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "That's everything. Then I'll have legal finalize the charter and HR will be in touch by noon." She paused. "Logan. Yeah, thank you for saying yes." He thought about several responses and settled on the honest one. "Thank you for asking the right way." He could hear, in the silence that followed, that she understood what he meant. The right way was not the salary, though the salary was real, and would change things for him, and Ellie in ways he was still getting used to thinking about. The right way was that she'd asked for his knowledge and his judgment, and the specific combination of things he actually was, rather than asking for a version of him that was easier to categorize. She'd asked for the Navy SEAL, who had become a maintenance worker, and understood both, and was neither completely anymore. She'd asked for the actual person. That was not nothing. That was, in Logan's experience, rarer than most people recognized. Paperwork took a week. The division charter took 2 weeks after that, with 2 rounds of revisions that involved Logan, Audrey's legal team, and a facilities management consultant named Barrera, whom Logan liked immediately because Barrera asked hard questions and wrote down the answers without editorializing. The first hard question Barrera asked was in the initial charter meeting. Around a 21st floor, the eastern quadrant was still closed, temporary support structures still visible from the street with Logan and 2 of Audrey's senior operations people, and a woman from HR named Delphine who had been taking careful notes since the meeting started. The equal access reporting structure, Barrera said, looking at the draft language in front of him. Who resolves disputes when a maintenance worker's safety flag conflicts with an executive's operational timeline? The safety division, Logan said. And if the executive disagrees with the safety division's assessment, they can appeal to an independent engineering review. But the flagged activity stays paused until the review is complete. One of the operations people, a man named Carruthers, who had been with Sterling Crest for 11 years, and who had the careful neutrality of someone trying to assess whether this was a thing he could live with, looked up from his copy of the draft. That's going to create friction with project timelines. I know, Logan said. Some of those timelines are contractually sensitive. Pause could cost the company significant. A collapse costs more, Logan said. Not aggressively. Just as a fact, delivered at the same pace as everything else he said. I know that's blunt, but the math on Tuesday morning was pretty clear. Problem existed. The flag existed. The flag didn't reach anyone who could act on it in time because the process allowed it to be deprioritized. I'm not interested in building a division that has the same process problem with a different label on it. Carruthers held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at his draft. Fair, he said, which, from a man who had been carefully neutral for 90 minutes, Logan took as meaningful. Barrera made a note. Audrey, sitting at the head of the table and largely quiet since the meeting started watching, Logan had noticed, with the same complete attention she brought to everything said, we proceed with Logan's structure. Carruthers, work with the legal team on the appeal process language so it has clear timelines that limit exposure on both sides. I don't want an appeal process that can be weaponized to extend a pause indefinitely that defeats the purpose too. She looked at Logan. That work for you? Yes, he said. She nodded and moved to the next item. He started officially on a Monday, which meant his first day in the new role was in an office on the 31st floor of Western Quadrant, clear of the remediation zone, with his name on a door placard that he found slightly disorienting and which Ellie, when he told her about it, declared to be extremely cool. Does it say your full name? She asked. Logan Vance, Director of Global Safety and Crisis Response. She repeated this slowly, testing the weight of it. That's a lot of words. It's a lot of job. Are you nervous? He thought about whether to give her the parent answer or the honest answer, and gave her the honest one, because she was 8 and sharp and would know the difference. A little, he said. She considered this. That's okay. You were nervous when you started the maintenance job, too. He looked at her. How do you know that? You made a list, she said simply. You only make lists when you're nervous about something. He looked at his daughter, her steady eyes, her matter-of-fact delivery, the way she held information about him, without using it as leverage or making it a performance, just filed it and carried it the way people who loved you carried things about you. Yeah, he said. I made a list. Was it a good list? I think so. She went back to her colored pencils. Then you'll be fine. The Eastern Column remediation took 6 weeks and 4 days, which was 4 days over Dr. Salas's estimate, and which nobody complained about because the 4 extra days were spent on a thorough re-inspection of the connecting beams on floors 12 and 13 that Logan had flagged in the margins of the original remediation report. The inspection found 3 additional stress indicators that would have required separate remediation work in another 12 to 18 months. Addressing them as part of the current work saved the company an estimated 2 weeks of future disruption, and a significant sum that Audrey's CFO characterized in the quarterly review as a material favorable variance attributable to proactive identification. Logan read this in the quarterly summary and thought about the maintenance ticket he'd filed 2 days before Tuesday. He thought about it for a while. Then he built it into the division's first training module as a case study anonymized, structural details changed about the difference between information that existed and information that moved. He ran into Audrey in the hallway outside the executive kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon in November, 6 weeks after he'd started. She was carrying a coffee and a folder and walking with the focused momentum of someone between two things that both required her attention. He was carrying a site assessment binder from the Denver property and walking in the same direction. They fell into step beside each other without any particular decision about it. "Denver," she said, glancing at the binder. "The cooling system on their sublevel 3 has the same classification logic flaw as ours did," Logan said. "Different HVAC manufacturer, same underlying decision tree. I've been on the phone with the regional facilities team twice this week."
"How bad?"
"Not bad yet. Identifiable early," which is the entire point. He paused. "I'm sending Reyes out there next week. She's the best systems analyst I've found in the first hiring round. She thinks the way the problem needs to be thought about." "Good." Audrey looked ahead at the corridor. "The Chicago property flagged something yesterday. I saw it. Structural monitoring anomaly on their east parking structure. I've already reviewed the sensor data. It's likely a calibration drift, not a real anomaly, but I've got the local team doing a physical inspection this week to confirm." She nodded. "You saw it before I did." "That's the point," he said. She glanced at him sideways, not quite a smile, but moving toward one. "You're going to tell me that constantly, aren't you?" "Only until it stops being true." She almost laughed, which was close enough. They reached the point where the corridor split and their directions diverged, and she stopped and turned slightly toward him. "The board reviewed the division's first quarter projections last week," she said. "There was less friction than I expected. Carruthers did good work on the appeal process language." He did. "But the projections help too. The Denver finding alone." She stopped. "They're starting to understand the math. That it's cheaper to find things early than to respond to them late." "It always was," Logan said. "The math hasn't changed. Just who's looking at it." She held that for a moment. "Fair point." He started to move and she said, "Chloe's been asking about Ellie." He stopped. "They met at the evacuation site," Audrey said. "For about 20 minutes. Chloe talked about it for a week. Something about the fox drawing. Ellie showed her the fox she was working on. She carries pictures of her art sometimes. Chloe wants to see the finished version." Logan looked at her. "Are you asking if the girls could spend some time together?" She met his gaze directly, the way she always did. "Yes, let me ask Ellie." "Of course." She started to move. Then, Logan. "For what it's worth, the board isn't the only one who's understanding the math differently." She said it without elaborating, without softening it, without the decorative language people usually wrapped around things they weren't entirely comfortable admitting. Said it the way she said most things, straight at it. He understood what she meant. He didn't say so, but he understood. Ellie said yes to seeing Chloe with the enthusiasm of a child who had a limited number of people her age she could talk to about art, and she brought the finished fox drawing in a cardboard folder she'd made specifically for transporting her work, which Logan thought was both practical and entirely her. They met on a Saturday in December at a coffee place near the park. Logan, Ellie, Audrey, Chloe, which was a simple enough setting that nobody had to pretend it was something it wasn't. Two adults having coffee while their daughters sat across the table from each other. Farsadar, and within 4 minutes were involved in a detailed discussion about whether foxes or wolves were better subjects for large format colored pencil work, with references and counterpoints, and the complete mutual seriousness that children brought to topics they cared about. Logan and Audrey talked about work for the first 20 minutes. It was honest rather than a dodge work, was the ground they shared, and they were both more comfortable there than in the undefined territory of two people having coffee on a Saturday. But around the 30-minute mark, the conversation shifted, the way conversations did when the professional scaffolding had served its purpose and the actual people underneath had run out of reasons to stay hidden. Audrey talked about her father, about inheriting a company that was failing and being 26 and having people in every room waiting for her to be wrong. About the first 3 years of running Sterling Crest when she had averaged 5 hours of sleep and had given up on the possibility of being wrong slowly enough to correct course. Logan talked about the end of his SEAL career, about the operation he'd told almost nobody about, not the details, just the shape of it, the one that had gone right in every way that could be measured, and had still left him sitting in a briefing room afterward, unable to identify what he was feeling except that it was large and without edges, and that he'd looked at his CO and known, without being able to say why, that it was the last time. He didn't tell her about Ellie's mother. That was for another conversation, if there was one. She didn't tell him what it had been like to be alone at 30, with a daughter and a company, and nobody in her life who didn't either work for her or need something from her. But they were both talking around the shape of those things, and they both knew it. Across the table, Chloe was holding the fox drawing at arm's length and declaring it museum quality with the authority of a 9-year-old who had been to 3 actual museums and felt qualified to judge. Ellie was watching her with the expression of someone whose work was being taken seriously, which was the expression she most liked to have. Logan looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the woman across the table from him, who was looking at her daughter, and whose face in that moment was entirely different from the face she brought to board meetings and operational reviews open. In a way that wasn't accessible anywhere else, the specific softness that children produced in people who were mostly hard surfaces. He thought about Tuesday morning, the corridor, the elevator down with keys, the locker room and the flashing red indicator, and the moment when he'd stood at the basement panel and understood what he was looking at. He thought about how different the day could have been. How many variables had to align to produce an outcome where they were sitting here, in December, with their daughters debating the artistic merits of foxes. He thought about something his old team leader had said once, after a difficult extraction sitting on a transport, 12 hours out, tired in ways that didn't have good names. He'd said, "The part that people miss about this work is that it doesn't end when the mission ends. The mission ends and you carry it with you. The question is what you do with what you're carrying." Logan had been carrying a lot for a long time. He was starting to think that carrying something and building something weren't mutually exclusive, that you could hold the weight of what you'd been through and still use your hands. The reopening of Sterling Crest Tower's eastern quadrant happened on a Thursday in late January, 18 days after the structural remediation was formally signed off by Dr. Salas's team and the City Building Authority. It was not a ceremony Audrey had explicitly declined to frame it as one, on the grounds that a ceremony would imply the building had been doing something extraordinary by being made safe again, when in fact being safe was what it was supposed to be all along. There was, however, a gathering. Employees from the eastern quadrant floors returned to their desks on a Thursday morning and found, at each workstation, a short letter from Audrey that Logan had helped draft over 2 evenings in early January. The letter acknowledged what had happened in October. It did not minimize it or dress it in corporate language or turn it into a narrative about Sterling Crest's resilience. It said there was a problem. The problem was found by someone who was paying attention and who was not given the opportunity to be heard as quickly as he should have been, and we are building something different now so that the next person who is paying attention has a clear path to being heard. Did not name Logan. He had asked her not to, and she had honored that without making it a negotiation. What the letter did say was that the new safety reporting protocol was active across all Sterling Crest properties, and that every employee at every level had the same formal standing to report a safety concern, and that the timeline for response was guaranteed and enforceable. It said this without making it sound like policy language. It said it like it meant it. Logan read the final version at home the night before it went out and thought it was the best piece of professional writing he'd been part of, which was not a category he'd expected to have opinions about. He was standing near the east atrium on the morning. The quadrant reopened the atrium that had been closed and inspected and repaired, and which now had a new pendant light fixture above the fountain, a simpler design than the previous one, which he'd had input on when Miles Danner came and stood beside him. They looked at the fountain. The marble around it was clean. The new fixture above it was solid and properly rated, and had been personally inspected by 3 different people, one of whom was Logan, before it was installed. Different, Miles said. New fixture. Not just that. He looked around the atrium, the returned flow of employees through the space, the ordinary weekday morning noise of a building working. The whole thing. Logan thought about what he meant. He thought about it honestly, which meant he acknowledged that Miles was right. It did look different, not in any way that a stranger would notice, but in the way that places looked different when something significant had happened in them, and the people who knew what had happened were standing in them again. "Yeah," Logan said. Miles was quiet for a moment. "You know what I kept thinking about after Tuesday? For weeks afterward?" "What?" "That I almost didn't call you back." Miles said it without drama, the way people said true things they weren't proud of. "When you called from the lobby. My first thought was this is the guy who got fired this morning, and he's trying to, I don't know, make it into something. Create a situation that reverses what happened." He paused. "I called back because I've known you 3 years, and you've never been that kind of person. But it was close." Logan looked at the fountain. "I know," he said. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it honestly. It's less than it would have if it had gone differently, he said. You made the call. The right call in the end. People do that, they almost don't, and then they do. I'm not going to be angry at someone for almost getting it wrong when they actually got it right. Miles absorbed this. That's a more generous read than most people would give it. Most people haven't spent 12 years in situations where almost is the word that covers most of the outcomes you're grateful for. Miles nodded slowly. He looked at the fixture above the fountain. She's good, he said. Audrey. She's different than she was in October. She was always good, Logan said. She just had a blind spot. And now she knows the shape of it. He paused. Most people don't get to know the shape of their blind spot. She does. That's not nothing. Miles looked at him sidelong. You sound like someone who spent some time thinking about her. Logan didn't answer this, which was its own kind of answer, and Miles had been in security long enough to know how to read a silence. Right, Miles said. And then didn't say anything else, which was why Logan had always respected him. There was a dinner in March. Not a date that was the word neither of them used, because they were both people who had learned to be careful with words, and because the word carried implications that the actual thing hadn't fully grown into yet. It was a dinner, on a Friday evening, at a restaurant that was not too formal and not too casual, where Logan wore the best version of his ordinary clothes, and Audrey wore something that was clearly not a work outfit, and which he noticed and said nothing about. They talked for 3 hours, not about work, or not entirely. Work came up the way it came up when it was part of who you were, not as the subject but as context, texture, the shared language of two people whose professional lives had intersected in a way that had changed both of them. He told her about Ellie's mother. Not all of it, there were parts that were still his alone, but enough. Enough to explain the shape of certain things, the reason for the 4:30 priority, the particular quality of his attention to what mattered. She told him about the 3 years when Chloe was very small and Sterling Crest was barely holding together, and she had made the decision consciously to make the company work, even if it cost her everything else. She said she didn't regret it, which was true, and that she would make different choices now, which was also true, and that she wasn't sure those two things were in conflict. They're not, Logan said. How do you figure? Because the person who could make different choices now is the person the previous choices built. Can't have one without the other. He looked at the table, then at her. The seals made me very good at certain things and very bad at others. I wouldn't trade the good things. I also don't pretend the cost was small. He paused. Question is what you do with what you're carrying, not whether it's heavy. She held that for a moment. Who told you that? She asked. Someone I worked with a long time ago. Good advice. He was a good person. He didn't make it back from the last deployment. Logan said this factually, not performing the grief, which was old enough to have settled into the shape of something carried rather than something acute. But the advice stuck. Audrey looked at him across the table with the complete attention that she gave everything. I want to say something, she said. Okay. I'm aware that the circumstances of how we know each other are unusual, that there's a power dynamic in my company that we have to navigate carefully, and that some people are going to have opinions about this that are not entirely their business, but that we'll have to deal with anyway. She said this with the directness that was just how she was, no softening, no performance. I'm also aware that I fired you on the first morning we met, which is not a great origin story. Origin stories are overrated, Logan said. She paused. I'm saying I don't want to assume anything about what this is or where it's going. Neither do I. But I also don't want to pretend it's nothing, because it's not nothing. He looked at her, at the person across the table, not the billionaire, not the CEO, not the woman from the corridor or the boardroom or the sublevel with her hand on the stabilizer panel beside his. The actual person who was 30 years old and had built something real from something broken, and who had a daughter who thought foxes were subjects, and who had, in October, been wrong about something important and had chosen to change rather than defend. It's not nothing, he agreed. She almost smiled. The real one, not the controlled professional version, the one that happened when she'd stopped monitoring it, which he'd seen a handful of times now, and which he found he was cataloging without entirely meaning to. Okay, she said, then we'll figure it out. We will, he said. And they left it there, because some things didn't need to be resolved on the first night they were named. Some things needed to be carried for a while before you understood their full shape. Logan knew this better than most people. He had learned it in contexts far less comfortable than a Friday dinner, and the lesson had cost more than a dinner's worth of courage to absorb. But he'd learned it. 2 years after the Tuesday that almost wasn't, Sterling Crest Tower stood on the skyline the same as it always had. Glass and steel, 42 floors, a name on the city's architecture that most people walked past without thinking about. The eastern quadrant had been fully operational for nearly a year and a half. Port column had been reinforced to a standard that Dr. Salas's team described as significantly exceeding the original specification, which was a technical way of saying the building was safer than it had ever been. The safety division operated across all 14 Sterling Crest properties. In its first year, it had identified and addressed 19 significant maintenance issues across the portfolio, 7 of which the division's own assessments classified as having the potential to become serious events within 12 to 24 months without intervention. The Equal Access Reporting Structure had received 212 formal safety flags in its first 12 months. 2 had come from senior executives. The rest had come from maintenance workers, cleaning staff, security officers, administrative assistants, cafeteria employees. Every flag had been reviewed within 24 hours. Everyone. Logan had made sure of that personally in the early months until the process was running well enough on its own that his personal oversight could shift to systems rather than individual flags. That shift had taken about 7 months, which was longer than he'd expected and shorter than some of the more cynical members of his team had predicted. On the morning of the reopening anniversary, a Thursday, unremarkable in every external way, Logan was in the sub-level 2 mechanical room of Sterling Crest Tower for the first time since October 2 years ago. Not because anything was wrong, because the annual systems inspection was scheduled, and because he had a policy of participating personally in at least 1 inspection per property per year rather than reviewing documentation alone. He stood at the pressure management station and looked at the readings, which were exactly what they were supposed to be. Normal, steady, the unremarkable numbers of a system doing its job. He thought about the morning he'd stood here and looked at readings that were not those things. He thought about what followed. The shaft climb with the bad knee, the boardroom, the atrium. Chloe running toward him with her arms up, trusting a stranger completely because she was 9 and frightened, and he was the person in front of her. Stabilizer activation. The way the building had shuddered and then held. He thought about what he'd learned over 2 years, about what it meant to be the person in the room who understood the danger. He'd spent 12 years in the SEALs learning to be that person in conditions where the danger was immediate and physical, and the response had to be immediate and physical too. What the last 2 years had taught him was that the same capacity, the thing that read situations, identified where things were about to go wrong, moved without panicking toward the problem rather than away from. It worked at a different speed in a different context and was no less valuable for being slower. Prevention was not as visible as rescue. Nobody told stories about the meeting where someone flagged an issue early and the issue was addressed and nothing happened. There was no drama in that, no story. But nothing happening was the whole point. He had spent his career, both versions of it, trying to make nothing happen. Trying to be in the right place early enough that the story never needed to be told. He looked at the pressure management station one more time. Everything in its place, everything doing what it was designed to do. Then he closed his inspection folder and took the elevator up, not the service shaft, the regular elevator, 42 floors, and walked through the lobby past the atrium, with its fountain and its properly rated fixture, and its ordinary Tuesday morning crowd of people moving through a building they trusted to hold. And he went to his office on the 31st floor and sat down and started reading the Denver assessment that had come in overnight. That evening he picked up Ellie from school, which he still did, every day, 4:30, a practice he had no intention of changing, regardless of what his title said on the door. Placard she thought was extremely cool. Came out carrying her backpack and the cardboard folder she used for her art, and she had made something new, a large drawing of the fox and a wolf sitting together, which she showed him before they'd even reached the sidewalk. "They're friends," she said. "In this story I made up, they live in the same forest, and they're different, but they help each other." He looked at the drawing. The fox was orange and precise. The wolf was gray and slightly larger, but positioned lower on the page, so they were at the same eye level. "Is this for Chloe?" he asked. Ellie considered this as if she hadn't quite decided yet, which meant she had already decided, and was enjoying the process of arriving at the answer. "Maybe," she said. They walked to the car. The city moved around them the way it always did, indifferent and constant, producing its noise and its light and its 10,000 simultaneous stories, none of which were remarkable to anyone but the people inside them. Inside them was where everything happened. Inside the walls, inside the systems, inside the decisions people made about what they were willing to pay attention to and whose voice deserved to be heard. That was where buildings either held or didn't. That was where people either became who they could be or stayed where they were. Logan Vance had, at 38, been fired from a job he was good at by a woman who hadn't looked at him long enough to see him. He'd gone back into the building anyway. He'd gone back not because of what it would produce. He hadn't known what it would produce, but because the alternative was to be someone he didn't recognize. He'd gone back because a child was alone and afraid, and the building was failing, and he was the person in the room who understood the danger. Everything that came after the division, the dinner, the 3 years of slow accumulation of a life that looked nothing like what he'd imagined and more like what he'd needed, everything came from that moment and its simple requirement. You don't walk away from people who need what you have. You use what you have wherever you are for whatever the moment requires, and you make it home by 4:30. He held his daughter's hand, and they went to the car, and behind them, 42 floors of steel and glass caught the late afternoon light and held it briefly before letting it go, the way structures did when they were built well and maintained honestly and trusted to the people who understood them. That was enough. That would always be enough.